What is up, my people? Welcome to Fellowship Bible Church's Sermon Spotlight, where we're coming at you each and every week with a fresh service to debrief an effort to send biblical truth. What better way to do that than by the power of conversation? I am in the host seat today in the center table, Mark Francis. And with us today, we have two amazing people. One of them is not a senior pastor who gave the sermon. But we have Miss Alicia Battaglia. How are you?
I'm very well. So I feel good. I just sound bad. I've got the Mark Carey
Are you
syndrome.
doing the Mark Carey impression today?
I can be all over the place. So
Okay.
hopefully I won't get in a coughing fit.
Can you get as low of a voice as him, and can you get as high of a pitch as him to replicate the sermon?
I'm probably a competitor. I'm probably a competitor.
Mark, hopefully you're feeling well. That was you came across as like you were a trooper. So hopefully you're actually feeling well. It was just your voice. But yes, you've halfway heard him chuckle. Mr. Ben Sanford, how are you?
Doing well.
Good.
I had a snicker or two in the sound booth. When
You were in the
he
sound
came
booth.
Up and,
yeah,
that was funny. I was fixing something, and I didn't hear him say anything about him having a vocal problem. So the first time his voice cracked, I was like, whoa.
Yeah.
All right, then.
So real quick, we need you to give an announcement, Ben. This is going to be your last sermon spotlight as a staff member.
Yeah.
So tell us what's happening on your end of things.
Yeah, I guess that's maybe not public knowledge. I'm stepping out of my role here at the church to do to move into working with my brothers in their construction business.
Okay.
Just a new thing for Ash and I. We're trying to move away or not move away from here, but move away from the weekend responsibilities so that we can have a little more dedicated time together.
I get it. Yeah. I get it. My wife Erica calls herself a church widow. Basically,
That's funny. That's funny.
Yeah, we didn't really get into my role in the ministry until later on in our marriage. At least 6-7 years in. So I get it because there's this component of I'm always arriving at church early on my own, and she's always arriving at church early on her own. Yeah. And when it came to kids or any of the other things happening there, it fell on her lap. Yeah. And so I get that, and then there's the lack of sitting together, going to church together, being a family. So there's a sacrifice that's made on both ends. Yeah, for sure. So I appreciate you finding that out early on here.
Yeah, and it was we knew that. I think going into it, we were that was not concerning to us. It's still not necessarily concerning to us. It's more that, I don't know. I think going into it, it was where the Lord had us. And then lately, over the past year or so, we've felt like maybe the Lord is leading us out of that for a time. Don't know if I'd still like to be in full-time ministry in the long term. But for now, we feel like this is a good change for us. We're only 2 years into marriage, so to be able to be in church as a family unit is going to be really nice.
Well, we appreciate the work you've done. Not many people see it, but it's all the behind-the-scenes production and technical things that are happening week in, week out that make a choir, an orchestra, and a Mark Carey and a Mike Lucan sound amazing. So
as good as they can,
as good as they can, if they're sick, and beyond, all the many things. So
Thank you, Ben.
We're excited to have you here today, and let's just dive in. Just a quick recap of where we are. We ended the sermon series in the book of Acts. We pressed through with a couple weeks of Global Church Week, which is an amazing summation of Acts and seeing the faithfulness of God. And Mark saw it fit to circle back a little bit. We had some debates on what do we call this mini-series of, is it a rewind? Is it an addition? Is it an addendum? But no, it's digging deeper into the book of Acts, where I think Mark sometimes feels a little bit under the gun to continue and press on with certain chapters or verses as we go through a sermon series like this. And there's questions that he probably was brought to his attention, or he knew as he was digging into the book of Acts, that we're like, okay, there's some topics that we should touch on as a church that are related to what we studied and what we learned here in the book of Acts. So part one here is this whole idea of what do we do with Israel? What what about Israel? And so, Alicia, I'll just turn to you. Give us your kind of take and summation of what you gleaned out of this sermon, and let's dive deeper.
It's always a privilege to sit underneath Mark Carey's history lessons. Like when he starts to dig into history, and because that's his passion, like
Yeah.
he has a passion for
Even
history.
Erica said I could sit there and listen to Mark Carey for hours, unpack the history of
Yes,
Israel. And she's one who's like, okay, the sermon's 40 minutes, we're good. But she's like, keep it coming.
Keep going
Yeah.
because he's captivating, and he just invites you into the story, and so it's neat to be a student underneath his teaching. But another thing that I really appreciated about Mark is not just is he pointing out the history of Israel and the future of Israel, but he brought it back to just the amazing, sovereign, faithful God that we have. And among a people who are rebellious and don't deserve God's mercy, he is so steadfast, and he is so patient, and he's so long-suffering, and it's out of a heart of love. And I loved how Mark brought out the Deuteronomy passages, and how he calls Israel his treasured possession, and that he loved them, he foreknew them, and he has this amazing plan, and this chosen people are special to God. But God's heart doesn't stop there. It's so much bigger, and to think about the hard-heartedness and the rebellion of the Jews, and how they have over history rejected God. God has used that for a bigger purpose, which means that he's using that so that we Gentiles can come to faith. And so that is, like, I was just thinking about, wow, the wisdom of God and why he does what he does, and in his righteous, holy ways allows sinful people as a way to open the door for other sinful people to know him. And eventually, this beautiful tree is going to be grafted back together with the Jews and the Gentiles, and this final kingdom is coming. And so there's just so much hope for Israel and for us. And I just thought about Ephesians 1. If you have time, go back to Ephesians 1 and just think about the heart of God in this plan of redemption. And it's really rooted in love. It's in love that he predestined us.
And all the blessings that we receive, that's through there in Ephesians 1. Well, to me, it also is a reminder of God is a God of the Old Testament and New Testament. He's a God of all the ages. And sometimes we view him in terms of, okay, where we are in our current phase in life now, in the church age, and referring back to Deuteronomy, those promises and those blessings or cursings that God gave in Deuteronomy still are valid today. Yeah. And we're seeing the nation of Israel reap those cursings essentially for the rejection of the Messiah and rejection of God, Yahweh. And so,
well, and then too, in Acts, our key verse is 1:8, and that the gospel would be going out from Jerusalem to Judea to Samaria to all the ends of the earth. And so even in Acts starts us off with God's heart for the nations. Yes, Israel, but the nations too. And so it's just amazing how kind God is in his sovereign will.
what was your takeaway, Ben? Being in the sound booth, watching, listening? Yeah.
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, well, the Lord made promises to Israel, right? That were based on his word. They weren't based on anything that they did. Like, I think of, when he made a covenant with Abraham, he walked through that sacrifice, right? He didn't have Abraham do anything.
Right.
In fact, he intentionally had him just stand there. So to me, this stuff that we're talking about just shows the faithfulness of the Lord. Sovereignty for sure, but also the fact that, man, he keeps his word because he loves his people and because it's in his nature to be faithful. And so I think for us, man, there's a confidence then that there's all sorts of promises that he also makes about us, and we can be grounded in the truth of those because he's kept his word with Israel. He's going to keep his word, continue to keep his word in Israel. He's not done with them yet.
Right.
And so
That's key.
Yeah,
Yeah.
right. And so we can. I appreciated that Mark took it back to Romans 11 to show, look, man, they're set aside for a time for our sake, and we can rejoice because of that. But he's also made some promises that he's going to fulfill.
Yeah, let's touch on that a little bit deeper. But Mark's not here to answer the question of what's on the cutting room floor. What are the things that? So what are the things that you think he might have wished that? And we didn't hear from Mark, so sorry. You could have submitted your own questions to us, Mark.
Well,
but what do you think are kind of some of the key things that he would have said? Oh, I'd like to cover.
So for you, Mark, why do you think we should talk about Israel when it comes to digging deeper in Acts? What do you think the purpose is for that? Why did Mark Carey decide to devote this whole sermon to Israel?
It was in some of the conversations behind the scenes of just kind of preparing for the sermon and listening to some of Mark's thoughts, listening to maybe what the topic and theme of the series would be, and digging deeper. And it's interesting that this is the first topic. Israel. What about Israel? And like you mentioned, Ben, going to Romans 9 through 11 is a key, 3 key chapters there that I would encourage anybody to go back and read and look at, because I think Mark might have missed a little bit of that. He probably wished that he could have dug deeper into that. But why Israel? You go back and you look at the entire book of Acts, and time after time, obviously right away, there's the rejection of Jesus and of the Messiah. And then you go to the day of Pentecost, and thousands of people did come to faith and were baptized, but there were more that walked away in disbelief. You get to then Peter and thinking to himself, well, is this really for the Gentiles? And yeah, absolutely it is. And as he's preaching, man, he's trying to hit the Jews, and he's hitting brick walls. You look at Saul and how he was rejecting the Messiah right away and persecuting the church and rejecting the Messiah until Jesus knocked him off his horse, and then he's going and he's preaching from town to town to town, going to the synagogues first, getting rejected, getting ran out of town, and then he's like, okay, I'm going to go to the Gentiles. So he always went to the Jews first, then the Gentiles, until he finally put his foot down, like, I'm done. Paul's like, I'm done bringing you guys this message. And so there's this consistent rejection of the gospel by the Jewish people. And so I think that is coming to the forefront as a theme in the book of Acts, that is this subliminal, what about Israel? Right. What is happening? Why are they rejecting the Messiah? And I think that's relevant today because we're looking at the continued rejection of the Messiah. We're looking at the repercussions that Israel has faced over the years that Mark unpacked of the horrific things that have gone on to the Jewish people even today. And so there's this theme that I would just encourage everybody to go back and look at Romans 9 through 11, because he touched on it in the end, but you have to ask your question of like, is God not keeping his word to Israel?
Yeah.
Wasn't there this promise that he gave them, and they keep rejecting him over and over and over again? And so hearing the faithfulness of God through Mark's sermon come out to Israel only doubles down our remembrance of how he can be faithful to us today. And so there's that application point, I think, as well, that we can just be like, oh, let's relax. Let's just know that God's got, like you said, sovereignty of God is key. faithfulness, it goes hand in hand with where we've been here the last couple weeks in our church, which is great. So I can appreciate that, and I don't think he was able to fully develop that in his sermon to say, look at all the stories in the book of Acts that we covered where there's rejection, and then seeing the consequences of that.
Yeah, yeah. Another aspect that we talked about in our small group last night was the different, as far as like in our current time and what's happening in Israel and in the Middle East, the difference between the political perspective and military perspective versus the Christian and spiritual perspective of what's happening. And there are, I'm not going to go down any of those.
But that's definitely a cutting room floor topic. I mean, he only barely scratched the surface on, hey guys, there's stuff happening over there in the Middle East today.
Right,
You know, what's the biblical relevancy of that? Well,
right. We do know that it's in God's sovereign plan. But I was in reading in Mark, and let's see, it was Mark 13, starting in verse 3. This is when Peter and James and John and Andrew are with Jesus, and they're asking him about signs of the close of the age. And they said, tell us, when will these things be, and what will be the sign when all these things are about to be accomplished? And I feel like that's kind of where we're at. It's like, okay, what does all of this mean? You've spoken in your word, but help us make sense of what it all is, and how is it going to be accomplished? And Jesus began to say to them, see that no one leads you astray. And then he goes on to say other things, but I was just thinking about that, see that no one leads you astray. And the point of that response is, keep your eyes on me. And I think that in the heartbeat of what's going on in our world right now, the most important thing that we need to do is be keeping our eyes on Jesus and God's character and who he is and his ultimate heart in his plan of redemption and his heart of love and his heart of justice, and just knowing that he is good and he is faithful. And so, just resisting that temptation to go down all of the, rabbit holes of whatever, is buzzing about in our...
There's an interesting kind of sub-theme about the land. You guys remember that?
Yeah.
That there's passages that referenced the land and the relationship of God's promises to the nation for that.
Right.
What stood out about that to you? Because that's related to our current culture today, what's happening in Jerusalem, and that's the land.
Yeah. That's the controversial thing, right?
Sure.
I mean, to some degree, you can't get into that without getting into the politics of it. And I don't know, as the more I see the discourse around that conversation, the more I'm convinced that that God himself is the only perfect judge. He's the only one who is able to declare right from wrong truthfully. And I think we, maybe because we're removed from it, maybe because of, I think, to some degree, poor study of the word in some cases, I think we, in our culture, maybe it's just the people that I know and have conversations with and about these things, but I think we get some things in our head that are not true according to Scripture. They're true according to our culture.
I think our culture wants there to be peace. Our culture wants there to be lack of wars. Our culture wants there to be, peace in Jerusalem, and and so there's a political perspective that we can have that is seeking that temporal peace here, and then there's the spiritual perspective of recognizing that there's never going to really be peace in Jerusalem until Christ returns.
Right.
That passage that you brought up, Mark 13, he says, look, there's going to be wars and rumors
Right.
of wars and
Exactly.
earthquakes and famines, and don't be afraid. Those are the beginning of
It's the
birth, the beginnings
of the birth pains, right?
Like, sorry guys, this is just going to get worse.
And
Yeah.
It may not be now. It may
when
be,
I
I
went
don't
to
know.
Israel, you feel it, you
Yeah,
sense it,
yeah.
it's in your spirit. You see the tension. Watching the
Right.
news stories right now, I've seen news stories where a news reporter went to, one lady in a shop in Jerusalem who's Jewish and getting her take on the current tensions, and then he went right across the street practically to the different quarter, to the
Yeah.
Muslim quarter, and talked to a guy who's Palestinian, and he had his own take, and he's
Yeah.
like, what is it going to take for these people to get along? And,
Yeah.
and he's like, he didn't have an answer.
Yeah.
And just even today, that there are these tensions, and you feel it when I
Right.
visit there, and so the here in the here and now, we are just longing for Christ to return as believers. But for those that don't have that, they're just like, oh my gosh,
Yeah.
the world is going to end.
Right.
Things are
Yeah.
going to blow up. There's all this
I heard
tension.
a podcast the other day where the guy was saying that exact same. He's like,
Yeah.
this more than anything terrifies me because this could be the start of, But man, with the Lord, I mean, it's not that we're not concerned, right? It's not that, especially with the atrocities that are going on.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I mean, he's telling these disciples in that chapter, don't
Yeah.
be afraid. This
Yeah.
is supposed to happen.
Right. Right.
And to me, my wife and I talk about this a lot, that we have to keep coming back to, are we convinced that the Lord is good? And if we are, then okay, then we will trust him even when the situation itself looks a lot more concerning to us
Yeah.
than,
And with what's happening in Israel right now and in the past, there's not just Israel's side, there's the other side too, and there are the Palestinian people, and there are a few Christians in Israel. There are very few Christians in Palestine, but there are Christians there, and so I think that we, as believers, need to be praying for those Christians in those areas, in Israel and Palestine alike, that God would be using them during this time
Yep.
to spread the gospel. And we need to be praying for Hamas, that they would come to know the holy, righteous God
Yeah.
who created them, and just to see that it's not just a one-sided issue, that God's heart is for the nations. And so all of those nations surrounding them, God cares for them too. And the only way to the Father is through Jesus, whether you're a Jew or you're a Gentile. And may their their blind eyes be opened as
Yeah.
well.
There is this passage that I'm going to read because I find it to be very relevant. It's Psalm 122, and I was blessed to be able to do a devotional on this specific chapter, Psalm 122, in Jerusalem when we had our trip. And Caleb, you can remember this and reflect on this because you were there with us. But it's a song of ascent that every time people would come and migrate back to Jerusalem each and every year, they have specific psalms that they would sing and pray. And this one's labeled Prayer for Peace of Jerusalem. And just listen to what, even back in that generation, that they were looking for. I was glad when they said to me, let us go to the house of the Lord. Our feet are standing within your gates, O Jerusalem. Jerusalem that is built as a city that is compact together, to which the tribes go up, even the tribes of the Lord, an ordinance for Israel, to give thanks to the name of the Lord, for their thrones were set for judgment, the thrones of the house of David. Pray for the peace of Jerusalem. May they prosper who love you. May peace be within your walls, and prosperity within your palaces. For the sake of my brothers and my friends, I will now say, may peace be within you. For the sake of the house of the Lord our God, I will seek your good. And I have to imagine that as they're singing that, as they're approaching the gates of Jerusalem, they have no clue about what they're even saying about peace, and thinking the temporal peace. And I think you can even read into this and say, okay, are we praying for the true peace of Jerusalem, that there's no fights and bombs going off? But ultimately, I got to know that God has sovereignly ordained this passage to say, let's pray for the true peace of Jerusalem.
The Prince of Peace to
spiritual
come
peace,
to,
the eternal peace that we have been made at war with God through our sin, the enmity that is there, looking at where you can go with all the spiritual lack of peace that the nation of Israel has, and how can we pray for that even today. And sitting out, looking at Jerusalem, doing this devotional was amazing because you could just see the darkness that is there, and just the lack of not just temporal peace, but of the eternal peace that is there, and just the hearts that just, God is just longing for, and just looking for them to turn their hearts back to Him, to listen to that original decree from Deuteronomy to say, guys, if you just look to me, like, you will be blessed. If you look to me, there will be maybe that temporal peace. And it's just not happening because, ultimately we know that it's not going to ever have true peace until Jesus returns. But in the meantime, we can all pray for that. We can pray to that end that Israel does turn back to the Lord, that hearts will be changed in Jerusalem.
Yeah.
That believers can spread the word.
We're getting ready to start the book of Daniel next year, and Daniel prayed this prayer after the Babylonians came, and he prayed this for his people. And I think it's really interesting. Let's see, it's from Daniel 9, and I'll start in verse 4. I prayed to the Lord my God and made confession, saying, O Lord, the great and awesome God, who keeps covenant and steadfast love with those who love him and keep his commandments, we have sinned and done wrong and acted wickedly and rebelled, turning aside from your commandments and rules. And then he goes on further down in the chapter, and in verse 18, he said, for we do not present our pleas before you because of our righteousness, but because of your great mercy. O Lord, hear. O Lord, forgive. O Lord, pay attention and act. Do not delay for your own sake, oh my God, because your city and your people are called by your name. And I just think that's so beautiful because he recognizes Israel's sinfulness and their rebellious heart, and he pleads to God on behalf of God's character and who he is, and because he is a merciful God, he is an awesome God, and he sees God as who he is rightly, and he also sees the people and who they are rightly. So I think that having that perspective and humility to be able to see who you are and who God is, and it's all based on his mercy towards us.
I think we've touched a lot on our own personal applications here today. And so let's just summarize that. Like, in one quick statement, what's a takeaway for us as a church, as believers here in Winchester, Virginia, that what can we glean from this sermon and God's heart for Israel? Ben, what's your takeaway?
Yeah, I mean,
and you might have already said it, so repeat it.
Yeah. Well, yeah, for me, that was the we have a God who is faithful to keep his word, and so in my mind that becomes okay. He's kept and is keeping his word with Israel, and he's made promises to them that they can bank on then, whether they know it or not. So for me, as a believer, he's also given us a plethora of promises, things that are true of us as believers. And so I want to know what those are, so that, and I do, some of them, right? But I want to know to the depth of experiential knowledge, not just head knowledge, so that those things begin to, because we know we can bank on them, because we have a faithful God, then those things begin to impact us more than if they were just words on a page, you know what I mean, with no backing. So
Yeah.
Yeah, that's it for me.
Cool.
Yeah.
Alicia?
Well, Mark asked this question at the end of his sermon. He said, "Do you know this faithful God?" And yes, I do know this faithful God, but I want to know him more. I want to know him deeper. And in Romans, in our small group last night, we were just in talking about all of the different rabbit trails we went down. We kind of landed at the end of Romans 11. Oh, the depth of the riches and wisdom and knowledge of God. How unsearchable are his judgments and how inscrutable his ways. For who has known the mind of the Lord, or who has been his counselor, or who has given a gift to him that he might be repaid? For from him and through him and to him are all things. To him be the glory forever. Amen. So he's so infinite, and we can never stop learning about him and growing in deeper relationship with him. And praise God for those who put their faith in him. We get to do that for eternity. And that is the greatest joy and privilege that we could ever have, is just knowing him. So yes, my answer is yes, I do know that faithful God, but I want to know him more.
And for me, it's just the rest. No worries needed.
Yeah.
God is in full control.
Yeah, right.
He is sovereign, and so therefore, if there's bombs going off halfway across the world, or if there's bombs going off in our next door, he's got it under control. Yeah. And then from that, I have even a screensaver on my phone that I took from Israel, that constant prayer for the peace of Jerusalem. And so let's just pray that people will come to know the Lord. Pray for the nation of Israel, because we see their plight, and laying it out in a sermon doesn't do it justice of the millions of people who have been slaughtered because of just the atrocities of sin. And how can we just pray for their true peace and pray for Christ to return? So that's a lot of applications there, guys, but well done. Well done.
Yeah.
Let's think about what's coming up. Just the quick sermon series is going to take us through the Thanksgiving season into Christmas. So Mark's going to be hopefully back this coming weekend, Lord willing. And then we have Tim Sanford. Actually, Caleb's on for a couple weeks, and then Tim Sanford for this sermon series. So there's 6 different sermons. We're going to unpack one topic after another here of digging deeper in the book of Acts. Baptism service coming up this coming Sunday. There's plenty of other opportunities for you to get plugged in, which is including Light of the Night, Follow the Star coming up, ways to serve. So, go to the website for all those things. Thanks for being here, guys.
Yeah, man.
Oh, thank you, Mark.
You did well without the lead head
And
honcho
this was
here.
all last minute here, guys.
Yeah, no, it's good. Yep. The fact of the matter is that sermons are not meant just to take an hour, but rather transform a lifetime. So until next week, much love. God bless.